Pure Reason, translated by Max Muller, 1881 edition, Introduction, page 51. Space is not a discursive or so-called general concept of the relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. So he says space is not a general concept like in physics. In physics, space is treated as some kind of relationship between two objects or two things. But he says space is not that. Space is just a pure intuition. It is subjective. For first of all, we can imagine one space only, and if we speak of many spaces, we mean parts only of one and the same space. So he says there is only one space. And if we speak of spaces, we are merely talking about different parts of that one single unity that is space. Nor can these parts be considered as antecedent to the one and all embracing space, and as it were, its component parts out of which an aggregate is formed, but they can be thought of as existing within it only. So he says these parts of space cannot be considered as existing prior to the other part of space, or to this all embracing or this unity called space. There is no such thing as one space existing on top of or after another. There is just one single space, and within it there are component parts which form an aggregate. So space is essentially one, its multiplicity, and therefore the general concepts of spaces in general arises entirely from limitations. So he says space is just essentially one. Hence, it follows that with respect to space, an intuition a priori, which is not empirical, must form the foundation of all conceptualizations of space. So he says, hence, it follows that space is an a priori intuition. It is not empirical, it is not derived from something empirical, or it is not derived from empirical experience. Thus, then, space becomes the foundation of all concepts, of space itself. In the same manner, all geometrical principles, example, that in every triangle two sides together are greater than the third, are never to be derived from the general concepts of side and triangle, but from an intuition, and that a priori with apodictic certainty. So he says that the fundamentality or the a priori nature of space is similar to this fact that two sides of a triangle are greater than the third one. So this general concept about general fact about the nature of the sides of triangle is a priori. In the same manner, is a priori and fundamental, and it has apodictic certainty. In the same manner, the unity of space, the a priori nature and the non-empirical nature of space is the same. So he uses this example of the triangle, the fact that in every triangle two sides are greater than the third one. So he says the factuality of space being a priori is similar to the fact that two sides of triangle are greater than the third one. So in that manner, space is a fundamental foundation of all concepts. It is not just a general concept. Space is represented as an infinite quantity. Now, a general concept of space, which is found in a foot as well as in L, could tell us nothing in respect to the quantity of the space. If there were not infinity in the progression of intuition, no concept of relations of space could ever contain a principle of infinity. So he says the concepts such as foot, L, which define quantity of space, which are supposed to define quantity of space, do not actually define the quantity of space, because the quantity of space is infinite. They merely the measurements such as foot, centimeter, or kilometer, they define the relations of space, not the quantity of space, because the quantity of space is infinite. Next, we move on to conclusions from the foregoing concepts. So he concludes the following about space. Space does not represent any quality of objects by themselves or objects in their relation to one another. That is, space does not represent any determination which is inherent in the objects themselves and would remain even if all subjective conditions of intuitions were removed. So he says space is not a quality of an object by itself. Space is an internal determination which is not inherent in the object but in the subject. So space will remain even if you remove all the conditions of intuitions of an object. For no determinations of objects, whether belonging to them absolutely or in relation to others, can enter into our intuition before the actual existence of objects themselves. That is to say, they can never be intuitions a priori. So he says objects cannot be determined whether belonging to them absolutely, for no determinations of objects whether belonging to them absolutely or in relation to others can enter into our intuition before the actual existence of the objects themselves. That is to say, they can never be intuitions a priori. So he says space exists even before we intuit an object, but an object cannot be determined before it exists to us in empirical experience. Space is nothing but the form of all phenomenon of external senses. It is the subjective condition of our sensibility, without which no external intuition is possible for us. So he says space is nothing but the form of all the phenomenon of external senses. So if you can remember, he defined phenomenon as a manifold, in the sense that phenomenon has different parts. Phenomenon meaning the form and matter, the form or the material nature in which an object affects us. So he says this form of the external object, which is basically the order in which the manifold parts of a phenomenon are arranged, is nothing but space. So space is that form or orderly arrangement of different parts of the manifold which is received through external senses. So he's saying space is nothing but the form of all phenomena of the external senses. It is the subjective condition of our sensibility. So it is something subjective to our sensibility, without which no external intuition is possible for us. So without space, even in the presence of an object in the external world, it is impossible to intuit that object in the absence of space. If then we consider that the receptivity of the subject, its capacity of being affected by objects, must necessarily precede all the intuitions of objects, we shall understand how the form of all phenomena may be given before all real perceptions, may be in fact a priori in the soul, and may, as the pure intuition by which all objects must be determined, contain prior to all experience principles regulating their relations. So he says through space we can assume that the receptivity of the subject towards an object is determined by certain principles, and space helps us in forming such principles. It is therefore from the human standpoint only that we speak of space, extended objects, etc. So he says the concept of extended objects exists only because we humans are in space already, and then the other objects in space give rise to the idea of the extended objects, because there is no distinction between my body, the space which my body occupies, and the space occupied by an object in front of me. So the object in front of me becomes an extended object, not an object which is entirely in a different space or different realm of space, because there is no discontinuity between the space which my body occupies and the space occupied by another object. If we drop the subjective condition under which alone we can gain external intuition, that is, so far as we ourselves may be affected by objects, the representation of space means nothing. So basically, space is the subjective condition or the a priori condition of any external intuition. We can assume space to be some kind of necessity for our senses to even grasp what is in front of us. For this predicate is applied to objects only insofar as they appear to us and are objects of our senses. So he says space is also like a predicate, but this predicate is applied to objects only when they appear to us in front of us and not when they do not appear to us. So basically space is like you opening your eyes at the right time to see just the right object. So space is that condition of possibility of you being exposed to the object of your senses. The constant form of this receptivity, which we call sensibility, is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects as without us can be perceived. So he says space is that constant form of receptivity, which is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects as without us can be perceived. And when abstraction is made of these objects, what remains is that pure intuition, which we call space. So space is not, for Kant, space is not an abstract concept. It is that which makes abstraction of objects possible. It is that which makes concepts of objects possible, but it is not that. It is that part of pure intuition which remains when abstraction is made out of concepts. So space is not akin to a thought or a concept. As the peculiar conditions of our sensibility cannot be looked upon as conditions of possibility of the objects themselves, but only of their appearance as phenomena to us, we may say, indeed, that space comprehends all things which may appear to us externally, but not all things by themselves, whether perceived by us or not, or by any subject whatsoever. So he says, as the peculiar conditions of our sensibility cannot be looked upon as conditions of possibility of the objects themselves. So he says, space is concerned with the appearance of a phenomenon, and it does not concern our ability to see all things at once. So space is applicable only when we have a phenomenon in front of us, when we have a source of a phenomenon in front of us. The space does not allow us to think about objects in themselves or to see objects in themselves, because objects in themselves means looking at an object from all different angles and all possible angles or all possible ways at once, which is impossible because our senses are limited. The focus of our attention is limited to particular objects. So he goes on to say, we cannot judge whether the intuitions of other thinking beings are subject to the same conditions which determine our intuition and which for us are generally binding. So he says, it is true that space allows us to see objects which are placed in front of us, but this kind of receptivity, the role of space in intuiting or in seeing objects is different for different people. So I cannot predict how a triangle might look to another person, because the condition under which space allows me to see a triangle in front of me may be different from the condition in which space allows some other person to look at the same triangle in front of him. So if we add the limitation of a judgment to a subjective concept, the judgment gains absolute validity. So I see an object or a triangle in front of me based on the judgment that I myself can make about that triangle. And space makes it possible. The proposition, all things are beside each other in space, is valid only under the limitation that things are taken as objects of our sensuous intuition. So he says all things are beside each other in space is true only when we assume that all things are objects of our intuition, objects of our sensuous intuition. If I add that limitation to the concept and say all things as external phenomena are beside each other in space, the rule obtains universal and unlimited validity. So he says if I add that limitation to the concept and say all things as external phenomena are beside each other in space, the rule obtains universal and unlimited validity. So he says all things are external to us, but they all exist within space as external phenomena. But since there is no discontinuity between my body and the body of other objects, it is given that all objects and bodies are beside each other in space. Our discussions teach, therefore, the reality, that is, the objective validity of space with regard to all that can come to us externally as an object, but likewise the ideality of space with regard to things when they are considered in themselves by our reason and independent of nature of our senses. So he says the objective validity of space is as important as the ideality of space. So space also the space gives reality to not just the object but also the ideality of our intuition of objects. So space is both external and internal. So when you consider space as an objective or external entity, it provides validity to objects which exist externally. And if you think of space as an internal or a subjective condition of possibility of intuition, then space makes possible the abstraction of the concept of objects possible by treating that which is intuited as being independent of our senses. We maintain the empirical reality of space so far as every possible external experience is concerned, but at the same time its transcendental ideality, that is to say, we maintain that space is nothing if we leave out of consideration the condition of a possible experience and accept it as something on which things by themselves are in any way dependent. So he says space has an external characteristic. Space has an empirical reality as well. Space exists as an empirical entity because objects exist in space, but within us there is a transcendental character to space which makes possible the experience of other objects in our consciousness. So he says both are important. The internal as well as the external characteristic of space are important. With the exception of space, there is no other subjective representation, Vorstellung, referring to something external that would be called a priori objective. So he says in all our perception of the world, space being external is the only condition of possibility or is the only phenomenon which has subjective representation. So he says, with the exception of space, there is no other subjective representation referring to something external. So space has both characteristics, the subjective representation as well as an external characteristic. And that external characteristic that space possesses is an a priori objective. This subjective condition of all external phenomena cannot therefore be compared to any other. So he says space gives objects or external phenomena a subjective condition. The taste of wine does not belong to the objective determinations of wine, considered as an object, even as a phenomenal object, but to the peculiar nature of the sense belonging to the subject that tastes the wine. So he clearly explains the role of space in perceiving something like wine. So he says the objective determination of wine does not give us the phenomenal feeling of the taste of wine, because the taste of wine belongs to this peculiar sense that we have in our taste buds. So in the same manner, space, even if space helps to give, or space gives external reality to objects, the way an object is perceived depends on our subjective sense of that object. And that subjective sense of that object is merely space, is at least space, Kant says. Colors are not qualities of a body, though inherent in its intuition, but they are likewise modifications only of the sense of sight as it is affected in different ways by light. So in the same manner, he also gives the example of colors. Colors don't exist in an external reality. It is how colors appear to us in our sense of sight that we perceive it. Because for instance, a colorblind person can see an object which looks colorful in a different manner. To him, the color will look black and gray and white. So he says the intuition or the perception of an object is dependent on the sense in which we perceive it. It is not a property, the sense in which we perceive an object is not a property of an external object. And space helps us know that, because space is that binding singular unity within which I, as a subject with a body, exist along with or side by side the object that I am perceiving. So space, on the contrary, as the very condition of external objects, is essential to their appearance or intuition. So he says space, since all objects that I perceive are in space, space makes their appearance to me possible, but the way I perceive an object is subjective to me. The way I see an object is dependent on the way my sense of sight or my sense of sensing an object is shaped. Taste and color are by no means necessary conditions under which alone things can become to us objects of sensuous perception. So he says taste and color are not necessary conditions, because obviously space and color, taste and color are products or are the end products of us entering in a realm of intuiting them, because the taste of wine and the color of an object is what I perceive subjectively, depending on my sense of sensing, my sensation, which is peculiar to me. So taste and color are not like space. They are connected with their appearance as accidentally added effects only of our peculiar organization. So, the appearance of wine is not its taste. The appearance of wine is its availability for perception, for intuition. Taste is not an appearance of wine. Taste is an end product of grasping the appearance of wine. They are not there for representations a priori, but are dependent on sensation, Empfindung, nay, taste even on an affection of pleasure and pain, which is a result of sensation. So he says, taste and color are not therefore representations a priori, but are dependent on sensation, Empfindung, nay, taste even on an affection, Gefühl, of pleasure and pain, which is the result of a sensation. So he says, things like taste and color are not a priori representations, but space is an a priori representation because taste and color depend on sensation. Taste and color depend on space, and taste even more. It depends on our affection of pleasure and pain, which comes later in the process of sensation. They are products. Taste and color are products of our sensation, but space is an a priori condition for the possibility of any kind of sensation. So no one can have a priori an idea Vorstellung either of color or of taste, but space refers to the pure form of intuition only and involves no kind of sensation, nothing empirical. So he says we cannot have a priori or in an advance an idea of how something will appear to us in terms of color and taste, but space exists a priori because it determines, it refers to the pure form of intuition and involves no kind of sensation, nothing empirical. So when space has no element of empiricism within it, because space is needed, space is like a gaze in the sense that you have to gaze at something in order for it to appear in a certain manner, for it to have a color. So space is as fundamental as a gaze. Nay, all kinds of determinations of space can and must be represented a priori if concepts of forms and their relations are to arise. Through it alone it is possible that things should become external objects to us. So he says, it is by virtue of space that I know that there is a thing outside of me, because like I said, space is like gaze. Only when I gaze at something, I am aware that this thing that I am seeing in front of me is external to me, and it has a particular characteristic that I have to grasp in terms of color, taste, smell, etc.